Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Ich warte seit Wochen auf diesen Tag und tanz vor Freude über den Asphalt. Als wär's ein Rhythmus, als gäb's ein Lied, das mich immer weiter durch die Straßen zieht. Komm dir entgegen.
Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu and here's Stefan Bienkowski. And Stefan, you're back. How's it going? Long time no see.
I'm back from my holiday. Long time no see. I'm doing really well, refreshed, well rested. Well rested now because I struggle to get a decent night's sleep, to be perfectly honest with you, in Italy because I'm, as I often say to my wife, I'm built for like an icy tundra in like the far east of Europe. That's kind of what my physiology is. I'm the kind of guy who has to sleep with his foot out of the bed at night in the winter in Scotland, while my wife has got like 6 layers on the bed. So the idea of trying to fall asleep in like 30-degree heat in Italy was a struggle, but got home, now had 3 or 4 nights of a good night's sleep, so now I feel well rested. But yeah, that was a good holiday, and I was listening along to the show, reading your newsletters. Big thank you, by the way, to everyone who helped out while I was away. Seb, Matt, Mary, Kevin. I'm not sure if Chris was on, but it's always nice to say thanks to him anyway. And all the people who helped edit and stuff. So yeah, it was great. It's great to have new people on. I'm sure the listeners will be delighted to hear my dulcet tones return to the airwaves. But no, it was good. How have you been?
Yeah, good. And I mean, I want to extend that as well. James Knowlton helped out with all the editing. So yeah, it was great. And you know what? I think it made me realize how far this podcast has come over the last year and a bit, with the newsletter and of course the amount of people that now can jump on the show and help out or just contribute. I think it's been pretty impressive. So one of us is gone now. I think we have an easy 4 or 5 people that we can easily reach out to and ask if they want to come on, and they're all excellent contributors. So yeah, it's great. And like personally, I've been great too. Stefan, I thought I would have a nice few days with nothing to do. Did the tour, did the great Vancouver Whistler bike ride on Saturday. Thought the Germany-Japan would be a non-event. The national team game, of course. Did really well on the bike ride, by the way. Finished top 100, which I'm really happy with.
Congratulations.
Yeah, that was an awesome ride. Beautiful ride, too. And then, of course, when I did finally get to Whistler, I saw the result, and I realized that this week is not going to be quiet.
Good. Thank God Germany has you in cycling, and it has the basketball team to fly the flag, because the national team the football team just simply aren't up to the task right now.
Well, I posted that image yesterday, right? Because the men's hockey team, or ice hockey, to use the European term, won silver at the last World Championships. And then, of course, the men's basketball team, and this is a big accomplishment considering the amount of NBA talent that was at this tournament, won the World Championships for the first time in history. So maybe, yeah, good thing there's other sports Germany can fall back to.
Yeah, well, do you know what? I was actually for dinner last night with one of our colleagues who's German, and I was discussing the whole fiasco about Flick and how the decision was made, or the announcement was made during the basketball success. And, he's one of these, again, very typically German. He's got huge interest in so many sports. And he was like, "Oh no, Stefan, you don't understand how big a deal it is that we won this basketball title." He's like, I honestly feel like I got more joy out of that than Germany reaching the semi-finals of a World Cup. And I was like, really? Why is that? And he's like, well, because he's like, well, I've already seen Germany win the World Cup. I was in Brazil. I went to all the games. And I was like, you have no idea how uniquely German that perspective is, that you can say, I don't really care if Germany win another World Cup. I've already seen them do it. I was like, as a Scot, I'm just delighted to be at a tournament. But yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, we have tons of thoughts about all of this, and I have actually thoughts about the basketball team and why they are a good lesson for what Germany's soccer team should be. But we have to remember our sponsors. So we'll discuss everything Flick right after this break. This episode of the Gegenpressing podcast is brought to you by Bet Online. Football is back, and I mean American football, of course. And Bet Online is your number one information source for all your sports wagering info with all the up-to-minute stats, news, scores, and matchup breakdowns. Get the latest game odds, spreads, and totals from NFL and college football at your fingertips with Bet Online's real-time updates on statistic news and odds. From week 1 all the way to college football playoff and Super Bowl, Bet Online gives you the access to the best football promotions and contests available anywhere online. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to get in on the action. Remember to use the promo code BELIEVE, that is BLEAV, BELIEVE, to receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. So yeah, Hansi Flick gone, Stefan. I mean, after I saw the 4-1 result and I thought, okay, well, there's no way he's going to survive this. Personally, I think the DFB should have probably made the cut after Qatar. But, here we are. It's the worst record by the German national team since 1985, when a certain Franz Beckenbauer was in charge. Of course, he almost won the World Cup the year after. I don't think Germany is anywhere near that, or would have been near that with Hansi Flick. I have a ton of thoughts on this, and I'm sure you do too, but let's hand it over to our subscribers first. The Substack subscribers, there's a chat for anyone who has subscribed. And we got an overwhelming response in our forum. And I think you want to read out some of them first before we get into this.
Yeah, I'm beginning to think these guys subscribe to the Substack just so they can talk to each other in the forum, because there's so much going on here. I'll try and briefly read through some of them. Some people have left their own short essays, which people have gone back and forth responded to, so I'll leave them be since they're already talking. But anyway, here's a quick run through. Alex says, so you obviously say, what do you guys think of the sacking? Alex says, tough to say. Issue is potentially Hansi came in as the saviour and didn't produce. However, this playing group also stopped producing under Löw. Is that a manager or a player issue with the national team? Mark C says, we may need a non-German coach for the first time. These players have no clue how to play together and need new direction. The German national team is the holy grail for Germans. The patient is terminal, and we have been trying to fix him with hot chicken soup and some aspirin. Flick had to go. Let's bring in a super coach and rip this cancer out once and for all. Wow, very medical-themed approach from there. Craig M says, this is a matter of time before Ham, to be honest. Hansi did a great job at Bayern in unusual circumstances, but there was always a lingering doubt for me about his character. Is there a bit of passive aggressiveness in there along with stubbornness? ? I might be wrong, but contrast that with Brazo's sacking and how he took it. Will be intriguing to see where Hansi might go next and how that works out. Wish him the best. Justin McHenry, with my favourite comment, I think, says, so how long till Dortmund punts Terzic for Flick? Nate says, in all seriousness, if Bayern and Tuchel were to part ways during the season, I think Flick would be an interim coach for them to try to recapture the magic. I feel like Nate keeps, I think it's Nate, it maybe isn't Nate, but he tries to shoehorn everything. He tries to shoehorn Bayern sacking Tuchel into just about every discussion, if I'm not mistaken. He goes on to say, Flick wasn't working with the national team. They need a coach with no loyalty to players to come in and choose the best with no bias. Adam says, it obviously wasn't working and showed no signs of a turnaround coming, so better to make the change now rather than wait, like they did with Löw. Now those in charge need to do the hard work of figuring out why it didn't work. How much was Flick? How much were the players he chose versus what was available in the pool? Harold says, Germany don't have the players. 2 German finalists for the Ballon d'Or. This is in 2014. Looks like France under 21s could beat the German national team. Flick wasn't the problem, but he wasn't the answer either. Who else? Robert Cervantes says, I'm perplexed. I don't know if there are any solutions on the horizon. I'm so sad to see Hansi go. He has earned a lot of my goodwill for 2020, and Brazo, in my opinion, didn't conduct himself well when he pretty much forced Hansi out in 2021. Team in general looks like they have no solutions when they have the ball, and it moves too slow. There isn't enough dynamic movement in the danger areas to cause havoc. nor do they counter-press to win the ball high up and catch opponents off guard. There's a few back and forths with people. Obviously, you discussed it as well, Manu. You were discussing things with people. And I think that's more about Kunal says, I don't know if he'd take the job. However, I think Heinkes would be a great choice to unify the team with the German public, just because of the respect he has in the game. He always did a great job as caretaker at Bayern. We will discuss potential signings late, I think the second half of the show, Manu, but that's kind of the overall view. Like I said, there's a lot more in there. People having big discussions, which obviously I can't read out on the podcast because I'd be here for 2 hours. But if you are a subscriber, you can obviously jump in and have your thoughts. And if you're not, obviously do take a moment to consider it, because on top of the podcast and the subscriptions, I think people like discussing things, and we obviously have the match day threads as well, which people enjoy. So anyway, let's get back to our thoughts. And yeah, do you want to just jump straight in then, Manu?
Yeah, first sacking in DFB history. So historic. Of course, there was a few other names that would have probably been sacked if they hadn't stepped down themselves. Eric Ribbeck comes to mind, of course. In a spell that was possibly the only one that was worse than this. And, the points per game average highlights this. Eric Ribbeck had a points per game average of 1.5. Hansi Flick had one of 1.75, which is the second worst in history. I think I personally feel really sorry for Hansi Flick, because I do think that he is fundamentally a good coach. I think where this went wrong is that it wasn't a new voice for the players, for the national team in general, right? Because he was Joachim Löw's assistant, and he wasn't going to come in there and change the philosophy that he helped bring in the first place. And so, while I think he is a great coach, and I think he's a good voice, and I think the players like him, I think he wasn't the right man for it. And I think there's a huge difference between being, between not being a good coach and not being the right man. And I think, we really need to differentiate the two here. I think that's really important. But I had a feeling already, and I think I tweeted this after the last group of friendly games, that I said, like, this has to end. You need to put him out of his misery in some ways. And, we weren't really giving Flick any favors here either, because this wasn't going to work. There was no indication that this was going to improve. And you can turn around a national team really quickly. When Eric Ribbeck left, Rudi Völler came in as an interim. And you will have to remember that time was possibly even worse than this. Christoph Daum, of course, was supposed to be the manager of the national team long term, but he got caught taking cocaine. He couldn't take the job. And people have to remember that we've been here before. We've been in places, the DFB has been in places that are worse than this. And I also remember that the team back then was way worse. And the results actually turned around very quickly, because there was a form of pragmatism that comes in. And I think I'm curious what you think of all of that. And we think as you said, we're talking about coaching choices and so on later on. But my first takeaway I watched the press conference early on with Rudi Völler and Ilkay Gündogan, and I actually thought Rudi Völler conducted himself very well. I was actually very surprised by the press conference, to be honest with you. I think what needs to come next is a form of pragmatism. And that is, this team needs to be turned into a team. I saw the basketball team. I'm not a basketball fan, but I did watch the final. I saw them win the tournament. I watched the semifinal against US. I watched the final against Serbia. And you know what stood out to me? These guys were a team. And they were willing to yell at each other. There was a lot of conflict within that team, but they were willing to sort it out and produce on the court, right? And that is something that's really missing for me with this group of players. There's so much talk about quality. And yes, they're not France, they're not England, but they're certainly no worse than Argentina or Brazil. And that is really where I'm thinking, like, this is not a team, Stefan. The sum of its parts is producing less than it should. And yes, there is reasons, because there's certain positions missing, but there's also no pragmatism in place to solve the problem. And that's, I think, really what I want to see from whoever comes in next. Just be pragmatic. Make sure they don't get scored on in silly situations, And if they have to win the majority of the games 1-0, so be it. Who cares? And I think that's really what needs to come back. This team needs to go back to the fundamentals.
Yeah, in more ways than one, if you want to kind of bring in the DFB in that and the manner in which they've really struggled to kind of attract interest or, goodwill from football fans in Germany in general. It feels like, I know this is a very different discussion, so I'll just briefly say it, but you definitely get the impression that the feeling towards the national team is just entirely different from what your average match-going football fan in Germany feels towards their club. It feels far more corporate. It feels far more, sanitized. I don't know if that's because they're just kind of obviously training. They tour around the country and there's not really any momentum behind it. Of course, performance. If a team's playing terribly, then they'll obviously always struggle for, support. But a game at Wolfsburg, for example, like with all due respect to Wolfsburg, I don't want to be mean to the town of Wolfsburg. I've been there; it's a funky place, but it's not the kind of place you go if you're trying to get support back amongst the team. But anyway, I thought the interesting thing you mentioned, the word that I really narrowed in on was pragmatism, and I think that's a really important one to bear in mind here because, we all thought when Hansi Flick was brought in that it was the perfect fit to some extent because, he was always hankering for the job. He was never fully committed to Bayern Munich. And, considering that there wasn't a huge list of potential appointments after Jogi Löw, it seemed like the right idea. But now it feels like, and obviously hindsight's 2020, it feels like he was just a further extension of Löw's tenure with the national team. And actually, as I point out in my newsletter, you could almost draw a straight line between, Hansi Flick to Jogi Löw to Jurgen Klinsmann. And that's a, 19-year span where the national team has been not only coached and, team picked and the tactics drawn and the training methods arranged, but also just the whole manner in which the German national team has conducted itself, the way that the players are trained, the way that the youth teams are, developed. All of that has just been basically entirely controlled by, one man after the other over the course of 19 years, who have basically the exact same kind of ethos. Hansi Flick was Jogi Löw's right-hand man. Jogi Löw was Jurgen Klinsmann's right-hand man. And that means that not a lot has actually changed over the last 20 years. And I think that goes or nothing at all. And I think that goes some way to kind of explaining why there is this kind of malaise in the team. Because, if you're someone like Joshua Kimmich, for example, who I think is probably a good player to illustrate the issues in this team right now, you're basically working under someone who isn't going to change, hasn't really changed anything. Since he's been in a national team, nothing's really changed. There's obviously been minor changes between Löw and Klinsmann and maybe between Löw and Hansi Flick, but they've all been basically part of the furniture for 20 years now. So why would we expect any kind of huge, as Raphael Honigstein's book would say, Das Reboot or something, that what was needed was that again after Löw left, but obviously that's not what we got under Hansi Flick, and I think that's probably the crucial part here, and I think that probably goes some way to explaining why Germany have been such a mess right now. It feels to me like a kind of perfect storm because on the one hand you've obviously got a coach coming in who's basically just a successor to the previous one, in terms of tactics, in terms of system, in terms of the way he coaches. So there's no shake-up there. I think the other issue as well is that he came in at a time when he had to very quickly implement new changes, even if he wanted it, whether he wants to or not is up for debate, but he had to. And I do think the fact that Germany haven't got any meaningful games leading up to this competition has been a huge hindrance for them. You can even actually go back, because I remember looking through this on Sunday evening when I was kind of looking through his record as a German national team. You can even go back to that World Cup qualifying campaign that he had, and with all the respect to the teams in that group, they're all minnows. So, Germany didn't even really have any meaningful games in there. So then when you add that to the fact that all they've kind of got going into this kind of leading up to the tournament next year is just kind of, again, meaningless friendlies, it goes to show that, I don't know how many games he's in charge of, maybe 24 or something. At least half of those were just completely meaningless games. And I know that seems silly, but anyone who obviously goes to watch the football team, and especially goes to watch them in pre-season friendlies, will know that it's near enough impossible to get players galvanised, to get them to show any incentive in these friendly matches. And I also think, conversely, the only kind of way that you can get yourself galvanised in a friendly match is if you're playing a bigger team. So that's why the likes of, Colombia, Poland, Japan, when they come up against Germany in a friendly match, they've got something to play for. They've got a point to prove. They have to try and beat Germany. They can work through their tactics because they're playing a team that's going to try and impose themselves. But for Germany, they're just going to go through the motions. And I do think that plays a large part into why the team has been so tepid and so poor and really struggling. And then I think the third thing is also just the fact that there's just personnel issues in this team that you just can't overlook. I think historically, especially if we want to go back to that kind of Jogi Löw team that won the World Cup, Germany have always relied on Bayern Munich to kind of be the kind of skeleton of their squad, And that team under Löw was able to kind of rely on a strong Dortmund team as well. And when you brought them together, they formed a really great team. I don't think it's a coincidence that the problems in this Germany team are mirrored in that Bayern Munich side, in the sense that, Bayern right now do not have a solid defensive midfielder. So, Jogi Löw is having to turn to Emre Can or Leon Goretzka and Joshua Kimmich to try and find this sort of midfield duo. And he's struggling the exact same way that Thomas Tuchel is struggling to kind of square that circle. And I think the other issue as well is the fullback positions. Bayern Munich don't have any strong German fullbacks. So Germany don't have any strong German fullbacks. And actually, if you look through like Hansi Flick's last 5 or 6 games, not only has he failed to start the same backline twice in a row over the course of his entire tenure, which I think is a remarkable stat, but you look at the fullbacks he's been using, whether it's Marius Wolf, Joshua Kimmich, who was, I thought, dreadful against Japan, Nico Schlotterbeck at left back. I think it was quite telling that for 2 of the goals against Japan, one was a player skipping by Nico Schlotterbeck on the wing who had no idea what he was doing that far out. And another one was Joshua Kimmich standing watching a player tap the ball at the back post who he was supposed to be marking. So I think, I think it's sometimes quite literal. The problems are literally right there staring you in the face when you watch these games, in the sense that, so, the discussion about quality and whether Germany have enough good players and stuff is just something that no one's ever going to get to the bottom of, because it's a highly subjective thing. But I think the problem is that Germany have problems in key positions. They've got the 2 fullback positions. I don't think they have a strong enough defensive midfielder. And then you can even look at that number 9 position, which, we're both very sympathetic towards Kai Havertz. I think he's a great player, but that's not really working out right now either. And when you add that all to the fact that Hansi Flick had no meaningful games to try and forge solutions to these problems, I think that's what's led to this kind of huge issue and led to him ultimately losing his job.
Yeah, the question of quality, right, and whether there's players missing in certain key positions. I think if Joshua Kimmich wants to be a leader in this team, and the coach tells him, we need you at right back, then he needs to show that he's a leader and then perform in that role that he can certainly play in at a high level, possibly the highest level. And he's shown that in the past. I remember national team games against Spain where he was a world-class right back. Philipp Lahm, when he was told that he had to go back to play fullback at the World Cup in 2014, did it. He did his job, didn't like it, still did his job as a captain should, and helped win his nation win a World Cup. I kind of miss that from certain players in this group, that they step up and take the leadership role that they themselves demand quite frequently. And Joshua Kimmich is a good example here, right? The other thing that I think is a big issue is that I wrote my newsletter on Pascal Gross, right? who now at 32 finally got a sniff at the national team after being the most productive assist provider in the Premier League for 5 years, Stefan. 5 years. How is a player like that being overlooked so long? And that is, I think, something that this regime, going all the way back to the Löw era, has been known for, that they didn't always nominate players based on their performances for their club teams. And I think the Union Berlin's president has basically called out Flick this summer on this particular issue, right? Because there were certain Union Berlin players that performed very well for Union. And, we're talking about defensive midfield. Why is Rani Khedira not in that team yet? We're asking about why is there no number 6 in this team? Well, there is one that helped his team reach the Champions League. That is ultimately, that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about players that play in the Champions League. I look at this side, and yes, this should be good. They should be good enough to beat Japan, even with this setup, right? What was the statistic? 10 out of the 11 starters were playing in Champions League, and the 11th player was Florian Wirtz. I mean, sorry, but that should be good enough. That should be good enough, when you play against a team, and then you're talking about all the other issues. But for me, the two things, and you mentioned one of them, is the players that are on the field have the quality. What is missing is character, and then there's the right chemistry. What I mean by that is there is so much talent, but not enough will. What you're missing, Emre Can, he can show that, but he needs someone to balance him out. I don't see that either, because there is no strong character in this team. There is no Jude Bellingham in this team that can balance out Emre Can playing for Germany, right? Because a lot of these guys are super good with the ball. They're very talented with the ball. They have the technical abilities to come up with solutions. But what they're lacking is someone to just, in Germany, you say hammer on the table and say, this is how we're going to do it. And you need 2 or 3 guys in that team to do that. And I don't see it. I just don't see those players that can do it. And you do need that guy. And, I look back at the 1996 team, for example, that won European Championships. They had a player in their team called Dieter Eils, who was an absolute worker. He was the water carrier for this team. And this was a team full of talented players, but they needed someone to do the dirty work. I don't see that guy in that team, right? And this is where your comment, the number 6, comes up. And then, this is something that I do think Flick needs to be criticized for, and same for Löw before him. For too long, someone like Pascal Groß shouldn't have had waited 5 years to be called up. He is an obvious solution to many issues in this team. And then he came off the bench. I would have started him, right? Why is Rani Khedira not in this team yet? You made the point with Maxi Arnold many times, right? Why is he not in this team? These players all perform for their clubs at the very highest level. And they all, for one reason or another, are not in this team. And I think that a few of these faces would help this team enormously.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point I was making about we've had basically the same dynasty of coaches, if you will. It's just one emperor succeeding the next, and Klinsmann, Jogi Löw. It's also, and behind all 3 of them, there was Bierhoff, who was organising the whole thing as well. So if you're, say, a Marc-Andre ter Stegen, and you've been waiting and waiting and waiting to replace Manuel Neuer, you can understand why he'd be so disheartened, because he's, with every changing of the head coaches, he knows that nothing's going to change, because when Jogi Löw was Klinsmann's assistant manager, he obviously worked very well with Manuel Neuer in training, and when Hansi Flick replaces Jogi Löw, he obviously worked very well with Manu Neuer. So these coaches have these relationships with these players, which carries on when they succeed their predecessor. And that works with Pascal Groß. You're absolutely right. Ter Stegen's, I think, probably the most obvious one, because I thought he was one of the few players that played very well against Japan. He's a player who's been waiting for his turn. And yeah, you're right. This Germany team is full of players who get into the team based on reputation, based on name, more than anything else. And that's kind of why, more than anything else, we need that kind of big shake-up. There's obviously kind of already been the shake-up at the DFB itself, and we're still kind of waiting to see how the dust settles on that and whether there'll be big changes. I wrote a newsletter a few weeks shortly after the World Cup, actually, on the changes that were already being implemented in terms of the youth development. But I think more than anything else, they need to bring in a manager or a head coach or trainer or a Bundestrainer, whatever you want to call him, who can just wipe the slate clean with just about every player and can say with, Thomas Muller, thanks for your service, but, you might have been the last manager's best friend and you might have had a great chemistry with him, but I need to pick the players based on merit now. I have to move on from the Emre Cans, maybe the Rudigers, whoever else, there has to be a much bigger shake-up. And I think, crucially, with that shake-up, you need a head coach who can identify the problem positions in this team and compensate for them, because, we talk about France being a nation that is just full of talent and, having 6 or 7 players for every position. But even they had to use, Olivier Giroud as a kind of pivot up front to win a World Cup. Even they needed, to find a system that made Griezmann play through his skin for his country, where he wasn't doing it for Barcelona. You can go back to that Spain side. It was very similar. They made all sorts of compromises because they didn't have a proper number 9. And even that Germany team, obviously, with Hovedose at left back. So that's what happens when you have a proper squad and a proper manager who knows and perhaps has the time to identify the problems and to find solutions to them. Part of me kind of feels like Hansi Flick was on a height into nothing, because he would have never had the stretch of qualifying games to try and find solutions to his problems. He was obviously trying, because you don't pick a different backline every single game unless you are desperately trying to find solutions to those problems. I think the problem is that he was doing it in friendly matches in which, you can stick Joshua Kimmich at left back or Schlotterbeck or right back, Schlotterbeck at left back. Antonio Rudiger is going to show up and probably not play 100% because it's a friendly match. And that means you're really learning nothing from these players. You're learning nothing from these formations and tactics, which makes me kind of wonder what kind of head coach is willing to kind of parachute into this mess right now, just because, there's no other kind of qualifying games or stretch of matches to really fix these problems. But it's worth maybe talking about the main contenders and who we would maybe want for the job, because it'd be interesting to see where we both lie on that, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, historically, Germany's always been bad at friendlies. Just look at their record. They've never done well at those. And if people think this is different than in the past, then go on Transfermarkt and check out their friendly record. It really isn't good. It really isn't. That, of course, is no excuse to lose 4-1 to Japan. That shouldn't have happened, especially, as you said, the way it defensively worked out in the end. As for successors, I mean, there is one guy who really wants it. That's Louis van Gaal. And you know what?
Don't say it.
I don't hate it. I don't hate it. Say it. I don't hate it. But here's why I don't hate it. Louis van Gaal, I think, and I'm not saying it should be Louis van Gaal, but I'm saying it should be someone like him. I have some doubts about them going with Julian Nagelsmann, and he is the favorite, right? And that really worries me for many reasons. First and foremost, I don't think he has the power to stand up to Rudi Völler, Hans-Joachim Watzke, whoever else is in the DFB committee. Gremium is the German word for it. I guess committee is the English word. And tell them, no, this is not what we're going to do. I feel Louis van Gaal has dealt with this sort of stuff at Bayern. I think he or someone like him has the power to say, no, we're not going to do this. Louis van Gaal is very pragmatic. He's a Catholic that grew up in Amsterdam, right? Which is, is a certain brings a certain character that is not the typical Dutch character in some ways. You know, the Netherlands. I lived in Amsterdam, so I know the city well, and I know what kind of people it produces. And I think that he would bring that pragmatism that this national team needs, right? And I think he would make decisions that would be unpopular, but he would be able to defend them. I mean, he guided a Dutch national team into a World Cup, deep into a World Cup, without playing pretty football, right? And I think that is something that's a really tough sell in the Netherlands. Another person that really came to mind for me is Matthias Sammer, because Matthias Sammer is in many ways the German Van Gaal. And he just gave a really good interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung where he said, let's be honest here, we're lying on the ground, we're at the lowest point we are. And he said this before these friendlies, you know, and he's on the decision-making board as it is anyways. I think when Matthias Sammer says certain things in German football, people listen. And they will do as he says. Because he has, in many ways, he's the modern Franz Beckenbauer, right? And that when Beckenbauer said something in the 90s or early 2000s, everyone perked up and listened and would act accordingly. Sammer has that same power. And so I think I would really, really like him. So in summary, I think a younger experimental coach is not necessarily what this team needs, Stefan.
Yeah, well, I definitely get where you're coming from. They definitely need someone who can kind of push back on the DFB, who can push back on the kind of perceived wisdom of who should be playing, what system they should be playing, what formation they should be playing. I'm just not sure Louis van Gaal offers the kind of long-term solution, if you will, and I guess, you know, a Dutch manager in charge of the German national team also comes with all sorts of intriguing, side issues. But I think I think the point you make though about what these guys need to bring to the table is really important. Matthias Sammer is also one who was mentioned to me as well, actually. But I think his health issues, which he had some serious health issues a few years ago, and I think he's probably still reserved from taking on like a more public role like that, which I think is probably also why he was maybe not linked heavily with the Dortmund job as well in recent years. But no, I think that's a similar, because look, we're also talking about, you know, head coaches. The other two kind of younger ones are, you know, Oliver Glasner and Julian Nagelsmann are the ones being heavy linked. And I did speak to someone who's quite close to Nagelsmann about this last night, and they said, you know, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know whether it's a kind of coin toss as to whether he would take something like this, because it really depends on his career path and what he wants to do going forward. And look, we've talked about this before, you know, when he was linked with Chelsea and Tottenham, I think, after he left Bayern Munich. And, you know, regardless of what people said, I always said, look, he's not going to jump at a job like that. He's going to take his time. He's going to plan out his moves in the summer. And I think he is that kind of head coach. He's got a whole coaching team around him, which he takes with him. They all talk about what their ideas, what the 5-year plan and things. But, you know, having said that, I actually think he might be an ideal recruit, because he's the kind of guy who would come in and say, I'm going to do things my way. You guys get out of the way. I'm going to try and make this team work. And, you know, that's kind of what he tries to do at Bayern. It didn't work because, in a way, he felt like that team was being coached by committee. And I think it would only really work with the German national team if, you know, the likes of Rudi Völler and, you know, Watzke and whoever else kind of kept their nose out of the business and just kind of let him, as the kids would say, let him cook, you know, and get on with it. And I guess Oliver Glasner would probably be very similar. You know, he's a very committed coach when it comes to projects. He has to do things his way. You know, we saw that with why things kind of fell apart at Frankfurt in the end. But, you know, these are two guys that if the DFB were brave enough would say, you guys can do what you want with the national team. You can call up who you want, you can play whatever formations you want. We won't have any say in these things. Which seems logical, but unfortunately these things don't really go as straightforward as that. The only other one I would mention, which I thought was an interesting show, was from Christian Kamp at FAZ, the Frankfurter magazine, newspaper, FAZ, and he actually mentioned Stefan Kuntz, who, of course, is currently the Turkish national team manager, if I'm not mistaken. But perhaps more notably, was a very successful German under-21 head coach. Did have a year, won 2 under-21 Euros with the German national team in 2017 and 2021, and seems to be doing a decent job with Turkey, from what I can tell. He would be an interesting one, I think, because he's obviously proved, that he could work within the system, but whether he would be another kind of legacy candidate or one who would be more orthodox, shall we say, is maybe an issue in itself, because maybe people want something more drastic. I don't know, but I think the key issue here, and to kind of just echo what you said, whether you mentioned Van Gaal or Sammer, is they need to find someone who can basically stick the middle finger up to the DFB, stick the middle finger up to the person who's signing his checks every month and said, get out of my way. I'm going to drop Thomas Muller. I'm going to drop Joshua Kimmich if I have to. I'm not going to call up Leon Goretzka because he's not playing well. Those kind of brave decisions, and the DFB have to be able to step back from that and just let them get on with it, I suppose.
Yeah, Stefan Kuntz was my choice after Joachim Löw stepped down, because he guided, I think, the U21 to a Euro title in the second place. And that was a team that was definitely
2 titles and 1 second place.
Okay, so even better, right? And that was that. Those teams were definitely the talent on those teams was smaller than the results. He managed to put together teams that, despite obvious weaknesses, and we see these weaknesses now at the next level, right? Still had success with them because he first and foremost was able to form teams, and I think that is a really, really important part of being a national team coach in general. I look at, you already mentioned him, Didier Deschamps, right, at France, who is being heavily criticized at times by the press in France. And the reality is, Euro final, World Cup, another World Cup final, which they probably should have won if half the team wasn't sick. The results speak for themselves, and he's often made decisions that were very, very unpopular and didn't always play the football that the talent of his team could have played. And I think that a big part of being a national team coach, and I think that's maybe where Hansi Flick ultimately failed. Hansi Flick was too focused on playing the sort of beautiful football that won Bayern Munich a Champions League, right? You don't have time to necessarily implement that with the national team. And that is, I think, where, that brings me back to what I said earlier. And this is why, I'm advocating for a pragmatic solution, or a coach was willing to have that steadfastness to sell that pragmatism to the DFB. If Germany wins the next 5 games 1-0, I'm happy. And most Germans would be happy with that. In fact, they would probably be rallying behind that more than they would behind any other results, right? I tell you what, if Germany goes out and loses only 1-2 to France, or even draws France, everything will switch quickly, right? And I think Völler, I don't think he should be the long-term national team head coach, but I think he probably understands that better than anyone else because he's been there before. And he's done that before, right? So they need to find someone who can do this long term, and I think that is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And actually, not to Anglophile this whole thing, or Anglicize, or whatever the word is, but actually, when you were talking about Didier Deschamps, it made me think of Gareth Southgate's current situation at England as well, where he's a much maligned, often criticised head coach because he plays careful defensive football, doesn't pick the flashiest players, doesn't pick the players who are on form in the Premier League. He picks the players who fit his system. He picks the players who work within his system, that complement each other, that that compensate for the positions that England are very good in. And, you can say what you want about Gareth Southgate's style of football, but from an England perspective, historically, he's done a very good job in tournaments for England. And that's, like Deschamps at France, that's the nature of international football now. You need a pragmatic head coach who can find solutions to the problems that your team have. And I just think Hansi Flick didn't do that. And perhaps no one can right now because Germany are only playing friendlies. I do feel like that's a really important factor in all this, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see who they appoint and how it works out.
It can work. Jürgen Klinsmann, when we go back to just pre-2006, and we have to remember Germany was very much in the same situation as it is now, right? 2005 was not a pretty year in German football. And we expected disaster at the World Cup. And Jürgen Klinsmann called up players like Robert Huth. Remember him? And that was a very pragmatic decision because he just needed a typical defender. He didn't care that this guy wasn't world class. He just needed someone who did what a defender needs to do. And it was very basic, but it worked. And and then after that, of course, Germany built on that success at the World Cup where they finished third, overperformed properly, right? And built a team that then in 2010 and 2014 revolutionized football. The problem is the rest of the world figured out how to beat the system. And we're still playing a system that the rest of the world, everyone knows how Germany plays. And in sport, not just in football, in sport in general, the moment you become predictable, you're done. You're done. Because then it becomes easy to play against you. And Germany is predictable. Well, I saw a stat and I find absolutely mind-blowing, Stefan. Under Flick, Germany produced twice as many chances as they would concede, yet they still have a losing record. And that's because everyone knows how Germany produces those chances. And if you narrow the space, if you don't allow them to, if you allow to enter them the box, but don't, eliminate the players in the center, they're done. Then you just basically see them passing the ball around the box and create chances, in quotation marks, right? And I think that's also another reason why I'm actually a little hopeful about this change and the end of this era, because I think whoever comes in next, the first task needs to be to stop being predictable.
Yeah, absolutely. That not just in terms of the style of play, but also the lineup, the players you pick and stuff. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, this goes out just before the France game, so we'll obviously have to see what happens there. But yeah, it'll be interesting. It was nice of Germany to make sure the international break was entertaining enough. Thanks, Germany.
Yeah, thank you. We got a historical sacking to talk about, the first in DFB history. And I didn't think we would have much to talk about today, to be honest, Stefan. As you said to me on our WhatsApp chat, at least that's Monday's podcast sorted. So there you have it. I'm honestly, I'm really curious. I think this is a fascinating story. No matter what happens next, I grew up as a German. I'm German. I grew up as a Germany national team fan, huge Germany national team fan. But I actually think this might be a good thing at the end of the day. This will hurt, and it will hurt a little longer. But you know what? I actually think this was needed, Stefan.
Yeah, it was definitely needed. There's no doubt about it. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens and who they appoint. I'm really intrigued to see who they appoint. What kind of players, and obviously the DFB are obviously at this moment in time well aware that people are watching them closely to see what they do on and off the pitch to fix the problems of the last kind of 10 years. So they've got a lot of expectations on them right now. They're not doing a great job of it. So, but look, these are always the interesting times. It's always I guess, to borrow that old kind of journalism phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. People are fascinated in chaos and disaster. We all slow down when there's a car crash. We all want to know, we all want to keep an extra eye on disaster. So And more importantly, Scotland are absolutely flying right now, so I'm already guaranteed of good fun next summer. So I've got nothing to worry about.
Yeah. Well, maybe they'll use another like catchphrase. There's always opportunity in crisis. So we'll see how this goes. We're of course gonna cover the story. Your newsletter is on Germany. I'm not 100% sure yet how I'm gonna tackle it, but my newsletter is definitely also on Germany this week. So keep your eyes open for that. And I guess like whatever else content we're going to have this week is gonna largely focus on the German national team because of what's going on. With one exception, the preview show will be back because guess what? On Friday, it's Bayern against Leverkusen. So got great football to look forward to, which is nice. Okay, Stefan, I think we can wrap this up. This show is always brought to you by Bet Online, and we'll be back soon with more content. Until then, auf Wiedersehen.
In Sicht.
Thank you for listening to Believe. You can show support to your host by subscribing to the show and giving us a 5-star rating on your preferred platform. Check us out at Believe.com and search for BLEAV on YouTube.